Okay, and I'm going to make sure I do speaker view. And Marlene, somehow you're on the speaker view. I'm going to hide your camera. There you go. Thank you. And Kathy, if you want to turn your camera off as well. So good evening tonight. Oops. Good evening tonight. I'm Stephanie Gertz and I'm with the Wilmot Horticultural Society. And tonight we have a speaker talking about invasive plants and species. So invasive plants and species are considered one of Canada's greatest threats to the survival of the wild animals and plant life. In tonight's event, we'll learn how to prevent the spread of invasive species in our local area, but you could use this same information elsewhere. And tonight's guest speaker is it Derissa?
Yep, Derissa.
Thank you, Derissa from Community Action. She's a community action leader for invasive species at the Invasive Species Centre. And I'll let you, Derissa, to introduce yourself and what you're going to talk about tonight.
Sure, thanks. I'll just get my, oh, I'm not able to share my screen.
Oh, yes, let me update that. There you
okay,
go.
Perfect. While you're doing that, I'll mention my, oh, thanks. My name is Derissa Vincentini, and I am the Community Action Leader at the Invasive Species Centre. I've only been with the Invasive Species Centre for just over a year. I started last April. And prior to that, sorry, I'm just still trying to figure out my screens here. Prior to that, I was actually a forest research technician for several years, in and out of contracts and while I was finishing up school. And I graduated in 2017 with a Bachelor of Science in Biology, as well as a certificate in Geomatics, both from Algoma University here in Sault Ste Marie. And yeah, so I mostly, everything I'm going to talk to you about today, I've learned in the last year, and it was quite the learning curve, but it's been a very well rewarding one, and I'm happy to share that newly found knowledge with everyone here listening today and listening to the recording afterwards. Let me just continue fiddling with my screens here now that I got it shared. Pull up that. Okay, excellent. I would like to first just mention that I am speaking to you today from Sault Ste. Marie, which is located in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, home of Garden River First Nations, Batchewana First Nation, and the Métis Nation. And I would like to extend my sincere gratitude for their continuous stewardship of our surrounding land and water. I know my slides don't want to move. There we go. So to start off with a little bit about the Invasive Species Centre, the ISC's headquarters are here in Sault Ste. Marie, and if you're not familiar with us, we are a not-for-profit organization founded in 2011. We connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to help prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that may harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. And although our office is here in Sault Ste. Marie, we do have staff members spread out across the province, and our work takes place both provincially as well as on a national scale. We're going to start off with what I think is probably a review for some people tuned in today. However, I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So we'll start with the simple question of what is an invasive species? An invasive species is an organism that is introduced outside of its native range and causes harm within its newly introduced range. A non-native species is not inherently considered invasive. It actually has to negatively impact the ecology, economy, or society of its newly introduced range to be considered invasive. And typically, they actually affect all three of these. Some characteristics of an invasive species after being introduced are that they are fast growing and reproduce very quickly. So they are very prolific. They lack natural predators that would normally slow their spread and keep their populations in check. The target species lack natural defenses against the invasive from not having evolved alongside each other. And all of these characteristics contribute to the exponential growth of invasive species and the severity of their impacts. So now let's look at where they are. And invasive species really are everywhere in the world. Our native species are invasive to other parts of the world and vice versa. In Ontario, we have more invasive species than any other Canadian province or territory. We have 440 invasive plants in southern Ontario. We have 39 known or potential invasive forest insects, and we have 10 invasive tree diseases as well. And we also have 180 non-native and invasive species in the Great Lakes. The number of invasive species in Ontario is mostly due to being a large international trading and travel area, as well as having a high population density, which makes it particularly vulnerable to invasive species introductions because the local population then contributes to the spread once they are introduced. This graph here depicts the invasion curve of an invasive species introduction. As time passes, the invasive population grows and the more it costs to manage that species. So as you can see on the graph, the most cost-effective time to act is actually at or before species arrival. And that could be a local arrival within your community or all the way up to a high-level threat for a new introduction into Canada. The reason for this focus around species arrival also increases the feasibility of that species being successfully managed before it becomes established and widespread. And the earlier that we can detect an invader through the power of community science, the more effective we will be at managing it. Once a species is established, the strategy often shifts from eradication to management and containment, since eradication becomes less feasible and unfortunately too costly. So let's get into some of the plants. Invasive plants can have a wide range of impacts on our environment, society, and economy. Some of those can be more local impacts, and others can have a larger impact across geographical boundaries. Some of these include damage to infrastructure, outcompeting native vegetation, deterring pollinators, impacting human health. They can harbor invasive pathogens or impact important outdoor spaces. So we're going to get into some examples that will highlight some of the species to watch for in your gardens, in ditches, and along walking trails, or even in agricultural lands. It's not by any means an all-encompassing list, as we only have time to go over a couple, but at the end of the presentation, I'll reference some resources available to you if you want to dig in deeper on your own time as well. So let's start off with garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an edible herb native to Europe and is considered one of Ontario's most aggressive forest invaders and severely threatens biodiversity. The most identifiable feature is the fresh smell of garlic when you crush the leaves, and this is more potent in the youngest plants. This plant is a biennial and has a 2-year life cycle. Within 5 to 7 years, garlic mustard can enter, establish itself, and become the dominant plant in the forest understory, doubling its population size every 4 years. This plant is allelopathic, which means that it disperses chemicals within the soil that prevents the growth of other plants and grasses. This chemical can also deter animals from eating the plant, so it's not providing anything to the ecosystem either. Garlic mustard has a 2-year life cycle, like I mentioned, so with 2 distinctive identification features. The first year plant, grows in clusters called basal rosettes, and in this stage, a strong root system is developed and the plant overwinters. This is also the stage where it resembles native violets, as the leaves are dark green and kidney-shaped. And you can see that in the left-hand picture. The second-year plants are those that have survived the winter and can now produce seeds. These plants will produce hundreds of seeds in one season and have a long bean pods with white flowers and triangular leaves, as you can see in the right picture. Most invasive plant management will require year-over-year return to the site and follow-up, and some plants will even require revisits twice during the growing season, and garlic mustard is one of those. The actual act of managing garlic mustard, however, can be fairly simple. The plant can be hand-pulled by grabbing it at soil level and being sure to get the entire S-shaped taproot. And you want to focus your control efforts on the second-year plants before they go to before they produce seeds to help prevent further seed dispersal. And the best way to start is with outlying populations and work your way inward, especially if you're working with such a large population and you're going to tackle it year after year. Start with the outlying population and work your way in. The best time to manage garlic mustard is actually mid-May, so about right now, into early June. And it is one of the first green plants, as you may have noticed on the landscape in the spring. So this makes it really easy to manage early in the year. You don't want to pull the plant once it has started to produce seeds later in the summer, because this can actually contribute to spreading it even further. Because this is one that's easily managed by hand pulling, albeit year after year, so you have to tackle it for 5 to 7 years consistently. It does make an excellent candidate for stewardship and volunteer removal. It doesn't require any previous experience or training, and it's very effective way of managing, so volunteers are left having a sense of accomplishment, which is great. Since its introduction, garlic mustard has spread throughout Ontario, parts of Quebec, and established populations into Western and Atlantic Canada. So it is largely spread across the landscape, but there are still cities that still have little to no garlic mustard populations in them at all. Thunder Bay is actually one of them. We worked in Thunder Bay a couple years ago and identified that there was only one park that had garlic mustard in it in the entire city, and or at least that was known. So we worked with local naturalist groups and they were able to manage it year after year, and now it's down to only like a handful of individual plants, which is a great success story. There are a lot of resources available on our website, including a how to pull guide and a how to pull video, as well as how to host a garlic mustard pull event, and best management practices. So check out our species profile on garlic mustard to find all of these resources to set up your removal events or management events. Next, we have Himalayan balsam. It's an invasive herbaceous plant that was initially introduced to North America as a garden ornamental. And I think you can see why, because it has such beautiful pink flowers. Himalayan balsam typically grows to 1 to 3 meters in height with soft green or red tinged stems and toothed leaves that grow 5 to 23 centimeters long. The crushed foliage has a strong musty smell, which is much less enjoyable than a nice garlic smell of garlic mustard. The flowers are pink to purple, as you can see in the pictures, and they have a hooded shape to them. They grow about 3 to 4 centimeters tall and 2 centimeters broad, and the flower shape has often been compared to a policeman's helmet as well, if that helps you remember what they look like. The seed capsules will hold up to 16 seeds each, and this plant is part of the impatiens family, also known as the touch-me-nots. And this means that when its seed capsules mature, they dry out and then will explode once they're touched. Seeds can spread up to about 5 meters from the actual parent plant. Himalayan balsam does have a lookalike native species called spotted jewelweed, which is also a touch-me-not, but has an orange flower instead of a pink one, and the flower is also much smaller. It also has thinner leaves with no jagged edges, and the plant itself is much smaller, only growing as tall as about 1 to 1.5 meters high. Himalayan balsam produces really dense stands, creating monocultures and reducing biodiversity by limiting nutrients and habitat availability, and also shading out native plants. This photo of a walking trail that was quickly taken over by Himalayan balsam here in Sault Ste. Marie. And this area was also actually inundated with a bunch of bees. And that's because this plant's prolific nectar production draws pollinators away from other plants and is the main draw for gardeners wanting to attract more pollinating species. However, growing this plant should be avoided as it spreads rapidly and quickly overtakes native species and reduces biodiversity. One Himalayan balsam plant can actually produce over 800 seeds, allowing them to spread very quickly, both naturally through wind and animal dispersal, but also through human interference due to their explosive pods. This species can aggressively replace native perennial plants along river banks, which over time leads to soil erosion due to their extremely shallow root system. Smaller infestations can easily be controlled by hand pulling as well, especially since they have that really shallow root system. However, management should only take place if there are no visible seeds, as disturbing the seeds can lead to further infestation, especially in freshly disturbed soil. You want to make sure that you pull all of the plants present, as leaving even just one can inhibit your progress for next year's management. And as the seeds are not very robust and only last in about 18 months in the soil, management can actually be completed in just 2 years, as long as proper disposal has occurred and all plants have been removed from the area. So you can check out our Himalayan balsam species profile, where you will find all the resources, including newly produced technical bulletins just last year, and all management resources as well. Himalayan balsam is widely distributed across Canada and can actually be found in 8 provinces right now. I want to talk a little bit about a couple ground covers as well. There are a few that should be avoided when choosing plants for your garden. The impacts across these ground covers are very similar, so they quickly escape cultivation and take over an area if not properly contained. They also produce very dense matting, and they suppress the forest floor, including both native plants as well as some tree seedlings. While a lot of nurseries are working to exclude invasive plants for sale, these plants can still be commonly sold at grocery stores and box store garden centers. So it's important that community members are informed about the impacts and make conscious decisions when purchasing plants. The management of these different ground covers differ based on species, but you can find all of that information on the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website as well, if you're looking to manage them. The 2 photos that I have here up on the screen, just to give some context, are both from a woodlot here in Sault Ste Marie. In the first photo on the top, you see periwinkle and then variegated and non-variegated goutweed. And on the bottom, you see yellow archangel across the entire forest floor. And both of these are from the local neighbors dumping their garden waste into the forest. And it spread quite rapidly. English ivy is also a good example of a plant that is invasive outdoors and can take over natural spaces, but is commonly used as an indoor plant in pots, which is okay as long as dispersal is done properly. It has deep green waxy leaves that can be lightly or deeply lobed, and that waxy coating allows the plant to cling onto surfaces and climb really well. In natural environments, these dense mats can damage infrastructure, cause tripping hazards, and smother and choke out native plants, including saplings, losing culturally important tree species, which is a concern. And it can also be toxic if ingested by humans or animals as well, so another concern there. Management is similar to many invasive plants, including hand pulling and cutting. You want to cut as much of the vine as possible off of the trees and pull the above ground vines and below ground roots up, bagging all of the plant materials into construction grade garbage bags. Like most plants, repeated efforts are needed year after year for effective management. I would just note that this plant can cause rashes to some people when handled, so make sure that you are wearing proper PPE, like long sleeves, gloves, as you should with any plant removal. Next, we'll talk about common reed, also known as Phragmites, or I'll probably refer to it just as frag. Frag can grow on land, but also does actually prefer wet ecosystems. Invasive Phragmites is very prolific, as it has 3 means of reproducing through seeds, stone, and rhizomes. There is a native cousin of Phragmites, which makes identification a bit tricky. No single characteristic can be used to identify invasive frag. So there are anomalies based on what type of environment it's living in. For example, wet versus dry environment or high nutrient versus poor nutrient environments. Thus, you have to look at the entire stand as a whole rather than just one individual plant. Alternatively, there is an option to take an environmental DNA sample if you have the means to do so. Generally speaking, however, invasive Phragmites has a rougher, duller stem, blue-green leaves, a well-attached leaf sheath, and grows in very, very high density. Invasive frag can grow up to about 15 feet tall, whereas the native Phragmites maxes out around 7 feet. Invasive Phragmites is classified as a restricted species under the Ontario Invasive Species Act, which means it is illegal to import, deposit, release, breed, grow, buy, sell, lease, or trade this plant in Ontario. Frag is very detrimental to the ecosystem because it doesn't just outcompete native plants, but it is another allelopathic species, producing chemicals and inhibiting the growth of other plants. So this is another reason you rarely see native species growing amongst a frag stand. Frag is also affecting species at risk reptiles in Ontario because it often establishes in their overwintering ground where it can completely change the ecosystem. So it grows so thick that turtles have a difficult time moving through the stand, and it also shades out the area, which is problematic since reptiles are ectothermic and rely on regulating their body temperature by basking in the sun. On top of the ecological impacts, Phragmites also causes high maintenance costs on roadways and properties as the new shoots can grow right through asphalt, causing significant infrastructure damage. Dead stems also become a fire hazard since they remain standing once they are dried out in these thick, dense stands. And Phragmites can also become a safety hazard on highways by reducing visibility around corners. Like I mentioned, there is a native Phragmites species, which looks very similar to invasive variety, which poses a challenge when managing frags since the native species can be beneficial to our environment. Another challenge is the location of many Phragmites stands, which interferes with species at risk. So regardless of the control method, species at risk and other native wildlife may be disturbed and endangered by management activities. Control activities should be strategically timed to reduce this potential harm to wildlife, and other mitigative actions should be taken to minimize adverse ecological impacts. When managing for frag, you want to try and time it to avoid seed. However, if this isn't avoidable, it is possible to bag and then cut the seed head prior to removing the plant. In water, frag is actually fairly easy to manage by manual removal of cutting the stem with raspberry cane cutters, a spade, or loppers. It is referred to as the cut to drown method. You do want to take caution when managing though, as the stalks are very sharp, posing a risk of injury. In terrestrial environments, methods differ depending on the substrate, population size, and resources available. Spading is an option in sandy substrates. Cutting is an option to reduce photosynthetic capabilities as well. And of course, chemical control is also an option. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council has produced a brand new best management practice guide that goes in depth on each management method and has details on everything that you need to know. So to review all of those management strategies, to find identifiable characteristics of Phragmites, visit our website. It's under common read and then Phragmites in brackets. And that's where you'll find the species profile with all of the resources or relevant resources. Phragmites is widely spread across Ontario, and its distribution demonstrates that relationship between human movement and invasive species very well. As you can see it establishing along corridors such as highways and right-of-ways, as you can see even just from this map following Northern Ontario. But I'm sure that you will, once you know it, you'll see it everywhere along highways in southern Ontario as well. So I'm sure many of you have heard that jumping worms are now in Ontario. I know that this isn't a plant, but it is an invasive species that is spreading primarily through horticultural trade in mulch, soil, and potted plants. There's also a possibility of their introduction through the sale of bait worms. However, this has not been documented in Canada yet. These worms refer to several species native to East Central Asia and were introduced to the US in the late 1800s. However, have only recently begun invading the Northeast and Midwest regions of North America. Jumping worm's skin is smooth, glossy, and rubbery, not slimy or squishy to the touch. Adult jumping worms can reach a length of 10 to 13 centimeters. And when disturbed, they thrash wildly back and forth in a motion reminiscent of a snake and can break off their tail segments to escape predators. And this is where they earn their nicknames of crazy worms, snake worms, or jumping worms. Jumping worms can be distinguished from other earthworms by their characteristic clitellum. It's a collar-like band around their body. The clitellum is a cloudy or milky white or grayish ring that is flush with their skin, and it's located only 14 to 16 segments away from their head. Jumping worms reproduce in an annual life cycle, with some being able to do so asexually, making them particularly effective at colonizing new habitats. Most adult worms die at the first freeze, whereas their eggs overwinter until April and are protected in their drought and cold resistant cocoons. These invasive worms outcompete other earthworms, and their castings degrade soil quality, leaving it inhospitable to many native plant species and susceptible to increased erosion. As they are voracious eaters, jumping worms quickly consume the top layer of organic material, making it difficult for plants to remain rooted and allowing nutrients to be washed away by rain. So this picture here shows that the soil disturbance caused by jumping worms and the castings that are left behind. And you can see that that organic layer is basically gone in that area. Still, more research is needed to determine what their actual impacts are to the environment as ecosystem engineers, and then subsequently the economy and society. And despite their wide dispersal across the United States, there are research gaps concerning their biology, and more research is needed into traits linked to their dispersal capacity, establishment, and spread, in order to counter their invasion and develop management strategies. You can try small-scale control methods by bagging and disposing of infested material or solarizing it, but the most important thing that you can do is try to reduce the spread by refraining from moving mulch, soil, or plants from invaded areas. Another area that we need to explore more is their current distribution. It may be possible that there are more than we know in Ontario, but we just became aware of them. And as of right now, there are 4 known species of jumping worms in Ontario, and the current sightings are concentrated in Toronto and Hamilton, and then in Windsor areas. Most observations are recent from this past year, and they're from gardens, backyards, and some parks. However, there have been some sightings in semi-natural environments, such as urban ravines in Toronto, unfortunately. So we've talked about what invasive species are and about some of the species you may encounter, but I want to touch on the importance of community science. Since you are a horticultural society, you are an organization that has the power to act and create change and help authorities that are working within this field. Although community science can create messy data, the real value is in increasing education and outreach with the public and giving the public a chance to be involved. Community science is an opportunity for collaboration between the public and the scientific community. And although sometimes messy, it is actually a cost-effective way of collecting important data and gaining access to new areas such as private lands, or covering more areas by having more people participate. Community members are actually contributing to important research and monitoring, which is a huge help. The more trained eyes and boots on the ground through the power of community science and community awareness, the quicker we can act and react to eradicate a new introduction. This will limit the size of the impact, as well as the number of introductions and spread in the first place. So now what can you do? Individually, we each have a role to play, and we each have responsibility to make conscious decisions. Some general ways to reduce the spread of invasive species in your day-to-day activities include cleaning your boots, your clothes, and outdoor gear of hitchhiking plant seeds, especially if you're moving from place to place or location to location. And buy and burn local firewood to avoid spreading insects and pathogens. When possible, choose native plants in your gardens. Not only will they be low maintenance because they can survive our climates, but they also contribute greatly to pollinators, birds, and other members of the ecosystem. Don't transport plants or soil over long distances, similarly to firewood. I like to use the example of Japanese knotweed, where you really only need a 1 centimeter piece of the root to start a new infestation. And we are also now seeing the spread of jumping worms, as I just talked about, and that's through the movement of soil and plants. And although not relevant to this talk on garden invasives, in case there are some crossover enthusiasts, water body pathways are also very important. So don't dump your bait in or near a water body, and buy locally sourced bait as well. And clean, drain, and dry your boat when transporting it over land. And I invite you to encourage these actions at your organization events as well. So create the means for your attendees to do these things easily by eliminating barriers. For example, have a boot brush station or a boot brush at your removal events. Talk about pathways on your platforms. Produce materials on where to buy native species locally. And just lead by example, things like that. When you are planning your management events, you want to make sure that you plan for properly disposing of invasive waste. Place all plant parts in construction grade garbage bags, and leave on a hard surface such as a deck, driveway, or a trailer for at least 1 week to allow the sun to bake the plants and completely kill them before disposing of them at a landfill. Improper disposal can lead to a new infestation and further spread of the species that you're trying to manage. The picture on the left shows Himalayan balsam creeping outside of a compost. And on the right-hand picture, it shows Himalayan balsam also popping out of a pile of garden waste disposed of in the bush. Also, when looking to host a community science event or a removal event, you want to pick projects that are stewardship applicable. And what I mean by that is sometimes the species that are more appropriate for public management efforts do not necessarily align with priority species. You want to pick species that require little to no previous experience and minimal training to make it easier on you as the host. You also want to pick species with minimal safety hazards. So for example, we don't want volunteers managing giant hogweed. And since repeated efforts are effective when managing invasive species, trained volunteers may be more likely to come back each year. And if there are new volunteers, your second year in, it doesn't take much effort for you to train them as well. You also want to pick species that are easily managed. That way volunteers are left feeling accomplished and like champions, and are more likely to participate in the future. Some species may require a coordinated effort between both volunteers and also a licensed contractor as well, so that may be something to consider. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, community science and removal events are opportunities to engage and inform the public. Even if the area does not get effectively managed, it's a way to open that door for communication to teach the public about impacts of invasive species and make some of those connections right there on the ground. Before you start a project or host an event, you also want to make sure you know the regulations. So for example, some projects may require a city permit or a permit to work on Crown land or things like that. So be sure to check out our legislation and policy webpage to learn more about current policies in Ontario and in Canada. Additional resources to consider when researching for your event include these searchable databases on our website to help inform your management strategies. Firstly, the best management practices database that we already talked about. There is also a risk assessment database, as well as one specific to pathways of entry and spread. And then I also encourage you to read the How to Host a Garlic Mustard Poll document, even if you are managing for different species, as there may be some transferable steps there. We have all these different resources available for you to read and create a management plan, and also teach volunteers how to remove different species. The best management practices and technical bulletins go in great detail on which management methods are applicable and work best for different population sizes or locations and things like that. So all I can say is visit the website and find these resources, because they're going to be very valuable to you. There are plenty of other initiatives that you can do with community members or members of the Horticultural Society for reporting and monitoring, not just management. So you can make a call to action for members to report any species that they find. This can be done by either setting up a project through reporting apps that individuals can participate in at any time, or you can host an actual survey event for reporting species at a particular park or a trail or a woodlot of concern to gain a baseline inventory of that area, similar to a BioBlitz, but for invasive species. There are several tools for reporting, and we like to encourage reporting through EDMAPS, which is the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. You can report by either downloading the app or by visiting the website. And the reason we encourage this platform is because the reports go directly to experts who verify that the identification was made correctly, so that you don't have to be the expert in the field. The reports that we get to EDMAPS are very important, as they help us make those early detections with more reports from community members, not just limited to the number of folks that are working in the field. They also allow us to map the distribution of invasive species across geographical boundaries, giving us the best holistic understanding, and the more reports that we get, the more accurate this is. It also helps with selecting sites for management and outreach, and increases local knowledge of distribution. It helps us understand the movement of invasive species over time, and has the potential to influence policy and enact a response plan for high priority species. You can also use EDMAPS to search for what invasive species have been reported within your area to help inform management plans or choose areas that you may want to use for your next removal event. Other ways to report a sighting are through calling the Invading Species Hotline or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency if it is a priority pest. And you can also use iNaturalist, which has tools for you to set up a project and report both invasive and native species, so that you can get a sense of biodiversity as well. iNaturalist reports that reach a research grade, which means that they have been vetted by the iNaturalist community, are uploaded into EDMAPS afterwards as well to add to those distribution maps. Another way that we encourage community members to take action is through our Community Science Tree Check form, which was created in partnership with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And this form allows community members to assess and report the health of their backyard or neighborhood trees, and look for signs and symptoms of the presence of invasive pests without any background knowledge of forestry or invasive species. In the form, we outline 10 common signs and symptoms that may indicate the presence of invasive pests, and all of these can be visually assessed without any measurement tools, field guides, poking, or prodding. This form allows community members to truly play an important role in making early detections in high-risk areas to prevent further spread of invasive species into our valuable forests. Other community science events could include public biodiversity gardens, which can encourage community members to plant native alternatives to commonly used non-native garden plants, and introduce the public to resources like the Grow Me Instead Guide by the Ontario Invasive Plant Council to help determine which native species to plant in replace of those invasive plants still found in garden centers. So I know that was a lot of information, but if you want more or a recap of any of this, visit our website at www.invasivespeciescentre.ca, and you can sign up for our quarterly newsletter, The Spread, or biweekly media research and event scans, and be informed of upcoming events and webinars, or stewardship and community science events as well. You also find all of the resources that I touched on today on our website. You will also find the species profiles if you had a question about a particular species, and to find best management guides related to those species in particular. And you may wish to also look to our YouTube channel to find past webinars that we've held, and you may have missed. And we also have how-to videos like how to manage garlic mustard by hand. So that might be a resource that you want to check out. And with that, I will say thank you again for having me today, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. And if there's any questions, I know I did see a couple pop up in the chat. Be happy to answer those now.
Hi, yes, thank you. Oh, look at this. We got someone popping back in. So I guess we have 3 questions, and one of them is, oh, here it is. Garlic mustard. Will scuffling first-year plants be effective? Can weed eating second-year plants before they go, weed whackering maybe or something at second-year plants before they go to seed be effective?
It certainly is not as effective as getting that whole taproot. So getting the entire taproot will ensure that the plant won't grow back, and garlic mustard can and will grow back within the same year, which is why I say you may want to visit the area twice within a growing season, because even if you are hand pulling, you may still miss part of that root and it can come up still. So it's certainly not as effective, but it may help if it hasn't gone to seed yet.
Okay. And I think that was the only, I think Patty, you said the same thing. Yeah, same thing. My question is, I downloaded the Ed Maps Ontario, but then it said that it was no longer going to be supported. So does that mean I just used Ed Maps S?
Yeah, so what happened there is originally we only had verifiers in Canada for Ontario and Alberta, so we each had our own platform. But now we've had verifiers interested from a couple other provinces. So Bugwood, which is the organization located at University of Georgia that manages EdMaps, they have moved to one single platform. So anywhere that has verifiers, it's all using that one EdMaps app. So if you do have EdMaps Ontario, this is the last year I think it is going to be supported. So make sure to download just the EdMaps and nothing extra.
Gotcha.
And it's actually been very beneficial because now those distribution maps show across the United States, because EdMaps is used in a lot of states as well, and then any province that has a verifier.
Okay, thanks. And I guess the other question I have is, would it be more beneficial to do EdMaps or iNaturalist? Because you said iNaturalist will download what their input into EdMaps.
Yeah, so really, I think it depends on what you are going after as an organization. We prefer EdMaps only because, like I said, your single report is going to go directly to an expert, and you're going to get a response quite quickly about what that species is if you made an identification correctly. And also, if it is a priority pest, then those verifiers will then enact an emergency response. So for example, with water chestnut, last year it was found in the Welland Canal, and that enacted an emergency response to then, okay, map out the extent of it. And this year, I think they're going to go in and manage it so that it doesn't spread further, because it is not a species that is widely found across Ontario or even Canada. So things like that, those are the reasons that we like to encourage EdMaps as opposed to iNaturalist. Whereas iNaturalist, to reach research grade, it might take quite a while. So that you don't get the same timely response. However, if your goal is to focus on biodiversity and you just happen to also capture invasive species in there at the same time, then that data will still eventually get fed into EdMaps. But it is also, once it reaches research grade, the verifiers don't go through it. They just bulk upload it into EdMaps. So it doesn't go through quite the same level of scrutiny, I guess. Oh,
sorry about that. Also, does anyone else have any questions for Derissa?
No, I have one. It's Kathy.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to say it? So, 20 years ago, we were all worried about purple loosestrife in all the waterways. And I understand they came up with some biological controls that were safe and effective. I don't know if it was a beetle, an introduced beetle or something. But is there any research going into that for either Phragmites or garlic mustard?
I know there is research right now on Japanese knotweed. And I believe garlic mustard. I'm not entirely sure about Phragmites, but yeah, with biological control, it is a great resource for managing across a landscape, especially when these species become so abundant across the landscape. However, it takes a long time to come up with the proper species to introduce or use for biological control. And a lot of research goes into it in controlled areas, and then it moves to semi-controlled and then out on the landscape. And you need to make sure that the species chosen is not going to affect any other species on the landscape and is very targeted to that particular species that you're trying to manage. So yes, that is, our step one is always trying to prevent the spread and introductions through anything that you can do, even on your day-to-day activities. Like I mentioned, brushing your boots, trying to plant native, not moving soil or firewood long distances, things like that. That's step one. Step two is local management to the best of our abilities. And then step three is that really, really long-term goal or long-term management with biological control, but it sometimes takes several decades to get to that point. But there is research that is continuing is ongoing, but it just takes a long time.
I could see a lot of really cool potential of working with youth, either in scouts or in optimist clubs or in schools, to be participating in, kind of like an I Spy, or they like going out hunting through the forest to find and identify things, take pictures with their parents' phones, and then upload them. And I can see this being, is there other groups you've seen kind of taking on that focus of engaging youth and kind of running programs in that way?
Absolutely. So I don't know if I think I still had it on the slide with the tree check form. I think I had Scouts Canada's logo there. And the reason is because we just implemented the tree check form last year, and it was a pilot project. And we worked with Scouts Canada to implement it into their programming. So we had, I think, over 150 reports from Scouters of all ages across Canada, checking trees for signs and symptoms of invasive species. And I think that was very valuable to just teach them what to look for in your trees and what might be causing those signs and symptoms. Like if you see increased woodpecker activity, that means that there's bugs in there, right? So what types of bugs are in there, especially if it happens quickly, then it could potentially be an invasive species because they take over so quite quickly. So I saw a lot of value in that. And then there is also a group in Sudbury that I'm working with this year to engage youth. It's called Junction Creek, and they're going to be doing several removal events with youth in that area. And last year I did a invasive species presentation with them the same group. So there's definitely opportunities to engage with youth. There are ways to make it more accessible to youth as well. I think the tree check form is nice because you don't need to learn all the identifiable features of each species. You just need to look at the signs. But you can definitely look for, if you're targeting one species, then you can teach them how to look for that and bring them to a park or a walking trail or something that you think of as you want to survey, and they can learn how to report to EdMaps or take photos and give them to you, and you can also bulk upload to EdMaps as well.
That's great. Yeah, so Gigi came in a bit late, but she was asking about Japanese knotweed.
Japanese knotweed starting to grow beside my property on public property. I did not talk about removing Japanese knotweed, only because it's not the best stewardship species to tackle. Japanese knotweed is, I would say, one of the absolute worst ones to try and manage. It's unfortunately very, very robust. There are a couple resources that I can send to you, Gigi, if you want to send me an email. However, if it is on public property, you will have to talk to the city and discuss with them if they, every municipality is different. If they have an invasive species section within their organization, or what resources they have available and what capacity they have. But you will have to work with the city if it is on public property. But I will put my email in the chat there. And if you want to send me an email, I will pass along some resources. The best one is the Best Management Practice by Ontario Invasive Plant Council, which you can find on our website.
I'm wondering also about Virginia creeper.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's kind of taking over my black raspberry area and just kind of suffocating it. Is that just the same thing as any weed? Just try to pull out as much as you can and snip it somewhere and just hope it dies?
Yeah, I haven't come across anything specific to Virginia creeper. I imagine it's try to get as much as you can, especially before any seeds are produced. And also making sure that disposal, you collect as many little pieces as you can to get them into a garbage bag and leave it out to die before disposing of it. And, not leaving any fragments behind if you can. I would check the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's website, which I can do as well, if they have anything specific to that species. But I can't recall if I've seen anything.
Okay, that's great. And so, it's really great that you think, that it recommends that, any new invasive groups start off with, mustard garlic, since that's an easy one. And actually, we were just at Patty's farm this past week, and we were commenting how nice and how rewarding it was feeling pulling all this mustard garlic, because it just felt so rewarding, because you could just hopefully clear an area and actually feel that you're completing something. So it was definitely a really good experience, and it really does, again, speak to the, a great beginner invasive species to pull.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, that feeling of being rewarded that you actually made a difference, I think is so key, especially when you're working with the public. It's nice to see that you've actually accomplished something, and I agree.
And so just recommendations, you do talk a lot about, starting up local groups and trying to start up new, teams and clusters of people in your community. Do you have any recommendation based on your experience of, best ways of doing this? Weekdays, weekends, 2 hours, just kind of, just generally what you've seen as work to actually find volunteers, keep volunteers, and keep them engaged.
Right, yeah. Well, unfortunately, I started last April, so I didn't get to do a whole lot of management opportunities myself, because it was still kind of under COVID regulations or restrictions during last summer. But my manager has talked a lot about it, and she was in my position for the last 6 years, I think. And we were just discussing it about Sault Ste. Marie here, and up here anyways, we find a lot of people go to their camp or go camping on weekends. So we find weekend workshops are less attended than during the week. But I think that would kind of depend on the location that you're in and, you know, the locals in your area. Maybe it's worth sending out a little survey or having a survey up that when people might be interested in attending and doing a bit of that groundwork first, just to get an idea. One thing that I think just from reading articles of other management activities across the province, I think if you do an event annually, then keeping it the same weekend or the same day, you know, the third Tuesday of every May or something like that, might help for people to just already know that it and set that day aside for participating, especially if they participated the first year and enjoyed it and felt that sense of accomplishment and things like that. That's a good way to help get people to return year after year. It also helps you to not have to like try and plan which day it's going to happen. And then you get the memo out maybe a little bit too late when someone's already planned for something else, things like that.
And
Yeah,
I'm just curious, like, I mean, one of the hazards of doing things in forest and woods is the problem with people trampling the understory and vegetation or insects, animals, and habitats. So when you're trampling through the woods to try to pull this mustard garlic, and you have a whole group of community people trying to go do that, I mean, best practices, or do we put guidelines out, or I mean, is it worth it just to get to the garlic mustard? Or
yeah, there's definitely a balance you want to try and keep. So here in Sault Ste. Marie, there's one park that we've been managing now for 5 years with garlic mustard. And this year we have our Sault College team, that students that go out and will survey the area before we host the garlic mustard pull. And this year they identified that there's not a whole lot of plants left, and that actually having a public garlic mustard pull might trample, like you said, some of those native species and will kind of be counterintuitive to what we're trying to do. So you definitely want to find that balance. If there is an infestation, that density, then you want to go in and you can have many people in there with their hands and feet. But once it starts getting kind of sparse, you might just want to have a small team go back and to limit your impact like that. So yes, there is a balance to try and find, but I don't have any harsh lines to identify for you.
yeah, absolutely. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Gigi, we recorded this, so you'll get a copy of this afterwards. So Patty has a farm. So I'm going to stop recording now so we can just chat